In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died holding more money than the United States Treasury. 96 years later, 120 of his descendants gathered for a family reunion and were told by the family historian that not one person in the room was a millionaire. This is Empires of Money, long, quiet histories of how the great fortunes were made and how they were lost, told slowly enough to fall asleep to. If you'd like the ledger opened again next week, the subscribe button is just below. Best to press it now while the lamp is still lit. There is a particular species of old money, not the old money of European titles and inheritance laws, but the old money of a nation that had just learned to build its own fortunes. America's richest families at the turn of the last century did not inherit their wealth. They had created it, brick by brick, railway by railway, with their own hands. The Vanderbilt fortune is the archetypal story of this American machine. It rose faster than any private fortune had ever risen, and it fell, not to war or depression or bad luck, but to the gentle insistence of silk, marble, and the belief that the money would never run out. In one generation they owned more than the United States Treasury. In 3 generations, among 120 descendants who gathered to remember who they had been, not a single one held $1 million. This is the ledger of the Vanderbilts. It is an old story and a quiet one. Now close your eyes and listen. Dim the lamp. I'll keep the ledger. The Vanderbilt fortune did not begin with titles or land grants. It did not begin with inherited estates or banking houses in distant cities. It began with a boy and a boat, and a man who believed that the water could make him rich. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on May 27th, in the year of our Lord, 1794, in a farmhouse on Staten Island, New York. His father was a farmer, and like most farmers, he was poor. His mother, also poor. The family's entire wealth consisted of 100 acres of moderately pleasant land, and the knowledge that there was something just beyond the horizon that seemed to want making into money. The water around Staten Island was busy with vessels. Ferries crossed it each day, carrying people and goods between the island and Manhattan. Most of them seemed to run on no particular schedule, and most of them seemed to arrive late. Young Cornelius, they called him Cornel, or sometimes just Corny, a nickname that would have humiliated almost any other boy, watched these boats with the steady eye of a child who knows he will one day own them. He was not a dreamer, precisely. He was something more dangerous, a realist born into poverty with just enough mathematical sense to see how inefficiency could be converted into coin. When he was 16 years old, in 1810, his father gave him $100 and a small boat, more as a way to get him out of the house than from any conviction that he might actually succeed in the merchant business. What the father did not understand was that his son had already understood something that most American men would not grasp for another generation, that speed and regularity and the systematic elimination of waste were not virtues for their own sake. They were an alchemy through which ordinary services could be transformed into extraordinary fortunes. Cornelius took that small boat and his $100, and he did not sail across open water in search of adventure. Instead, he became a ferryman. He established a route between Staten Island and Manhattan. He ran it on time. He charged reasonable rates. He was ruthless with inefficiency. Where other ferrymen seemed content to take a passenger or two and cross when the weather was favorable, Cornelius filled his boat, waited only for profitability, and began to offer service so reliable that merchants began to depend on him for their schedule. He was not beloved. He was too thin-lipped for that, too obviously engaged in the calculation of percentages, but he was indispensable. By the time he was 30 years old, Cornelius Vanderbilt had expanded his ferry operations to cover most of the routes between Staten Island and New York. He owned a fleet where there had been a single boat. He employed men, dozens of them, then scores, and these men lived in a state of constant anxiety about their wages because their employer, the man with the cold grey eyes and the reputation for squeezing a penny until it bled, seemed always to be thinking about how to eliminate positions entirely. It was said that Vanderbilt had a gift for intimidation, though this was not quite accurate. What he had was an absolute indifference to the feelings of others, combined with a mathematical precision about profit that made intimidation almost unnecessary. If you worked for Cornelius Vanderbilt, you worked quickly and carefully, or you did not work at all. There was no middle ground. There was no sentiment. There was only efficiency. The ferries made him money. They were not romantic work. There was no glory in hauling commuters and cargo across a few miles of water, but there was something deeply satisfying to him in the systematic accumulation of small profits into larger ones. Where other men might dream of grand schemes and sudden fortunes, Cornelius Vanderbilt was content to collect his percentages week after week, month after month. He understood that the compound effect of consistent profitability over time would create wealth on a scale that bold speculation could never achieve. This was not a subtle insight, but it was an insight that most people did not have, and Vanderbilt had it in abundance. By 1830, he was a wealthy man by the standards of the time. He had perhaps $30,000 or $40,000, a fortune that would be worth well over $1 million today. He had achieved this without the backing of wealthy parents, without inherited capital, without any advantage except his own intelligence and his willingness to work harder and longer than other men. For most people, this would have been enough. For most people, to have accumulated this much capital in a lifetime would represent a triumph worthy of satisfaction and rest. And having made this money, as was traditional for men of his background and era, he did what any thinking man would do. He looked for something larger to conquer. The ferries had been good, but they were limited by the geography of New York Harbor. The future, he understood, belonged to something larger, something that could move across greater distances and carry more cargo. The future belonged to the steamship. The water around New York was beginning to fill with steamships. The Industrial Revolution, which had come late to America, was beginning to arrive, and it was arriving on steam engines and iron hulls. Vanderbilt, now in his late 30s, began to pay attention to these vessels. He did not immediately leap into the steamship business. Instead, he watched it. He observed how the great shipping magnates operated. He noted where they were inefficient. He marked where his penny-pinching virtues might be deployed. And when, in the late 1830s, the steamship business was in a state of considerable confusion, there were rates that fluctuated without warning, routes that were abandoned when they were not profitable, and a general sense that these ships were magnificent, but nobody quite knew how to run them reliably. Cornelius Vanderbilt entered the market. He was 50 years old. He was no longer a young man. But the best part of his life, the part where he would accumulate the vast bulk of his fortune, was only beginning. The title Commodore was bestowed upon Cornelius Vanderbilt in his 50s, a mark of respect from the maritime community for his mastery of steam-powered commerce. It was a title he had earned not through inheritance or appointment, but through the systematic destruction of competition and the establishment of new efficiencies that made steamship operations profitable in ways that previous owners had not imagined. The Commodore did not invent the steamship. He did not improve the technology in any meaningful way. What he did was simpler and more valuable than either of those things. He made the steamship into a predictable, regular instrument of commerce. Before Vanderbilt's entry into the steamship business, the great ocean liners were considered almost financial experiments. You chartered a ship, you filled it with passengers and cargo, you crossed the Atlantic or sailed to distant ports in the Caribbean, and you hoped that the revenue you collected was greater than the fuel and operating costs. Most of the time it was not. There was waste everywhere, idle time in port, more crew than the work required, schedules that changed on the whim of captains, freight rates that were negotiated individually. Vanderbilt entered this chaos and applied the same method he had used with his ferries. He reduced crew sizes ruthlessly. He eliminated slack time in port. He established fixed rates and published schedules. He bought faster ships and ran them harder. And where other captains seemed to believe that a life at sea required a certain romantic looseness of operation, Vanderbilt believed it required precision, drilling, and the elimination of every unnecessary motion. The result was transformative. Vanderbilt's steamships carried more passengers with fewer crew, made faster passages, operated on smaller profit margins per voyage, and sold more tickets than anyone else. Where a competitor might take a $50,000 profit on a ship with a $100,000 operating cost, Vanderbilt would take $20,000 on the same cost, but do it 20 times a year instead of once. It was a fundamentally American insight, the realization that lower profit margins multiplied by higher volume could generate wealth on a scale that the older, slower methods could not approach. By the 1850s, Vanderbilt's steamship operations were vast. He was wealthy beyond the calculation of most men. He had perhaps $7 or $8 million, an ocean of money. And yet, the best was still to come. Because in his 60s, when most men were thinking about the preservation of what they had made, the Commodore turned his attention to something that was, in that moment, the greatest source of wealth in America: the railroads. The railroads had been built across the American landscape like a web, often without much consideration for profitability or strategic planning. A railroad would be chartered, constructed with a mixture of government grants and private investment, and then operated by whoever had control of it at any given moment. By the 1850s and 60s, there was a tangle of competing lines, inefficient connections, and routes that made no sense. The New York Central Railroad, one of the most important lines in the country, linking New York City to Buffalo and beyond, was a particular mess, a series of smaller railroads that had been more or less welded together, run inefficiently, and thought to be, if not worthless, at least unpromising. Vanderbilt acquired stock in the New York Central beginning in 1863. He did so quietly, using intermediaries, accumulating a large position. When he finally revealed himself as a major shareholder, he did what he had done with his steamships. He took control, and he made it run with a precision that nobody had thought possible. The railroad that had been thought to be barely profitable suddenly began generating enormous revenue. Vanderbilt consolidated the competing lines. He eliminated redundant routes. He reduced crew sizes and administrative costs. He negotiated ruthlessly with suppliers. He cut rates in ways that seemed suicidal, but which actually increased volume so dramatically that overall profit rose. By the time the Commodore reached his 70s, he had ceased to be merely a steamship magnate or railroad operator. He had become one of the wealthiest men who had ever lived. His railroad holdings stretched from New York to Chicago and beyond. He owned controlling interests in some of the most important transportation networks in America. When he died, on January 4, 1877, at the age of 82, his estate was valued at something close to $105 million, a fortune that exceeded the total assets held in the United States Treasury at that time. Translated into modern money, $3 billion, or perhaps slightly more. He had been a poor boy with $100 and a small boat. He had become the richest man in America. But wealth is a strange instrument. It functions differently in different hands. With the Commodore, wealth had been a tool, a means to the end of building, accumulating, consolidating. He had taken pleasure in the exercise of will, in the systematic replacement of inefficiency with rational order. But he was also a man of his time, and in his later years he had become aware that there was another use for extraordinary wealth, the building of dynastic legacy. He had children, and it occurred to him, as it has occurred to hundreds of wealthy men before and since, that his greatest accomplishment would not be the accumulation of his fortune, but its perpetuation. He resolved that his wealth should not be scattered among his 13 children, should not be dissipated in petty distributions. Instead, the bulk of his fortune, most of it, nearly 4/5, should pass to a single heir. That heir was his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. In giving his fortune to his son, the Commodore believed he was ensuring that the Vanderbilt name would remain synonymous with wealth and power for generations to come. He was wrong. William Henry Vanderbilt was born in 1821. He was not a natural businessman. As a young man, he had been thought rather dull, competent but lacking the fire and intuition of his father. He had served in the family businesses in minor capacities, accumulating knowledge without distinction. When his father, the Commodore, was in his 70s, William Henry was in his 50s, and there seemed to be a general assumption that he would inherit his father's wealth without ever inheriting his father's genius for generating it. It was thought that he would maintain what had been made. It was not thought that he would double it. And yet, when William Henry Vanderbilt took control of the New York Central Railroad upon his father's death in 1877, something unexpected happened. He proved to be not merely competent, but exceptional. Perhaps it was that he had learned from his father's methods without learning his father's limitations. Perhaps it was that he came to power at exactly the moment when the railroad system in America was consolidating, when it was becoming apparent that large, well-operated networks would dominate and smaller competitors would fail. William Henry Vanderbilt grasped this with an almost intuitive certainty. Over the next 8 years, he did exactly what his father had done in the steamship business and the railroads. He consolidated, he streamlined, he eliminated waste, and he expanded. The New York Central became, under his management, the most profitable railroad in America. He extended it. He acquired competing lines and folded them into the system. He negotiated alliances with other major railroad operators to ensure that the Central received the freight and passenger revenue that it deserved. His methods were not gentle. He fought ruthlessly with labor. He fought ruthlessly with other railroad operators. There is a famous story about him, probably apocryphal, in which he is said to have told a group of railroad barons who were demanding special treatment, "The public be damned." Whether or not he said exactly these words, the sentiment was accurate. William Henry Vanderbilt cared intensely for the profitability of his railroad. He cared not at all for the comfort or convenience of the general public, except inasmuch as their willingness to use his services generated revenue. By 1883, William Henry Vanderbilt was the richest man in America. His fortune had grown to approximately $200 million, nearly double what his father had left him in just 8 years. He had accomplished this not through any magical innovation or brilliant insight, but through the same method his father had used, the systematic application of ruthless efficiency to existing enterprises. The money had simply accumulated, faster and faster, until he had become incomprehensibly wealthy. At this moment of his greatest triumph, in 1883, something happened that would reshape the Vanderbilt family forever. His wife, Maria Louisa Crawford Vanderbilt, known as Frank, decided to throw a ball. This was not an unusual decision. Wealthy people threw balls all the time. But this ball, which took place at their mansion at 665th Avenue on March 26, 1883, was unlike any that had come before it. It was designed carefully and with considerable calculation to achieve something that money alone could not purchase: social legitimacy. The mansion at 665th Avenue had been completed just the year before. It was a stunning structure, French Renaissance in style, built at a cost of $11 million, with $7 million of that sum going simply to the marble with which the house was constructed. It was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect of the age. It was, without question, the finest residence in New York. But fine residences, no matter how expensive, do not automatically confer upon their owners the status they might wish for. In 1883, New York society was still ruled, nominally, by the families of Dutch and English extraction who had lived in the city for generations, families like the Astors. They did not welcome the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts were vulgar. They had made their money in commerce. They had not inherited it. They were, in the estimation of the old guard, not quite respectable. Alva Vanderbilt, William Henry's daughter-in-law, wife of his eldest son, also named William Kissam Vanderbilt, was not a woman to accept such a judgment without resistance. She was formidable in a way that her husband, despite his wealth, could never be. Where William Kissam Vanderbilt seemed content to accumulate money and let it sit in his accounts, Alva Vanderbilt understood that wealth was not primarily a tool for acquiring things, though she certainly acquired things. Wealth was a tool for acquiring power, and she resolved to use the fortune she had married into to breach the walls of New York society. The costume ball of 1883 was her instrument. She announced it months in advance. She planned it with enormous care. She invited 1,200 people. She had the mansion's interior transformed into something from a Venetian dream, with elaborate decorations and costumes rented at enormous expense. The champagne alone cost $2,000, equivalent to perhaps $60,000 today. The total cost of the entertainment was somewhere close to $50,000, which was equal to the annual salary of the President of the United States. But the real genius of Alva Vanderbilt's plan lay not in the magnificence of the ball itself, but in a single calculated act of social cruelty. She did not invite Mrs. William Astor's daughter, Caroline. Mrs. Astor, the leader of New York's Old Guard Society, the woman who was said to have determined who was in society and who was not, suddenly found herself in an impossible position. If her daughter did not attend the most talked-about event of the season, she would be humiliated. If she wanted her daughter to attend, she would have to do something she had sworn never to do: acknowledge, formally, that Alva Vanderbilt was a person of sufficient social standing to merit her attention. Mrs. Astor crumbled. She sent a calling card to the Vanderbilt mansion requesting an invitation. Alva Vanderbilt accepted it with perfect courtesy and perfect understanding of what she had won. The ball, which took place on a cold March evening in damp New York, with police outside holding back crowds of the merely curious and the impossibly envious, marked a turning point. From that moment forward, the Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders in New York society. They were the center of it. In this way, William Henry Vanderbilt, without doing anything but having a daughter-in-law with steel in her spine and a husband who was willing to spend $50,000 on a ball, achieved what he had perhaps always wanted: the fusion of his money with social power. The fortune that the Commodore had built, the fortune that William Henry himself had doubled, was no longer merely money. It was dynastic wealth, the wealth of a family that had transcended commerce and entered into the realm of what Americans, in the 1880s, could only call society. The mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue became the symbol of this triumph. It was the most expensive house in America, the most beautiful house in America, and, in the eyes of the society that now welcomed the Vanderbilts, the most important house in America. Nobody who attended the costume ball of 1883 would have predicted that within 45 years this mansion would be torn down, reduced to rubble and dust, with not a stone of its exquisite marble remaining above ground. If the costume ball of 1883 was the moment when the Vanderbilts gained entrance to society, the next 2 decades were the moment when they realized, with some confusion and growing anxiety, that entrance to society meant something very specific. You were expected to spend your money on houses. Not one house, not even 2, but rather an accumulation of houses, each more impressive than the last, each serving a specific purpose in the calendar and the geography of the Gilded Age leisure class. This was the logic of the Vanderbilt family from the 1880s through the turn of the century. William Henry Vanderbilt had created a fortune of $200 million. His son and heirs did not multiply this fortune. They did not add substantially to it. Instead, they spent it. And the primary vehicle for their expenditure was the construction of mansions. The estates that the Vanderbilts built were not simply expensive, they were expressions of a particular philosophy about wealth, that the greatest achievement of money was the transformation of landscape and matter into pure beauty, however useless and ephemeral that beauty might be. The houses were so large, so elaborately decorated, and so filled with treasures and art that most of them were occupied for only a few weeks each year. They were summer houses or spring houses, used as temporary refuges during what was called the season, the calendar of events and gatherings that defined the social year for wealthy families. The crown jewel of the Vanderbilt architectural ambitions was Marble House, constructed for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva between the years of 1888 and 1892 in Newport, Rhode Island. The mansion cost $11 million to build, and $7 million of those dollars went simply to the marble that covered its exterior and interior surfaces. To understand what this meant, $11 million in the 1890s is equivalent to approximately $400 million in contemporary money. It was an unimaginable sum to spend on a single house, and it was spent on a house that the owners planned to occupy for perhaps a month each summer, if that. Marble House covered 60,000 square feet. It had approximately 50 rooms. It was designed, again, by Richard Morris Hunt, and it was styled as a French Renaissance palace, as if the Vanderbilts might somehow transport the chateau of the Loire Valley to the rocky coast of Rhode Island. The mansion was surrounded by elaborate grounds, with formal gardens that were maintained by a staff of groundskeepers, a stable for the horses, and structures for the servants who attended to the house. The interior was finished with such minuteness of detail, the railings of the stairs, the handles on the doors, the decorative panels in the ceilings, that the construction required more than 2,000 workers and 4 years of labor. When Marble House was completed, Alva Vanderbilt held a housewarming. The party lasted 3 days. The guest list included virtually everyone of importance in New York and Boston society. The event was written up in every newspaper in the country. Photographs of the rooms were published. The general American public, most of whom had never seen a house with more than 10 rooms, could view pictures of these vast and bewildering spaces filled with marble and gold leaf. The message was clear. The Vanderbilts had arrived not merely in society, but at the very pinnacle of it. Just as Marble House was being completed, another Vanderbilt project was getting underway. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the son of William Henry Vanderbilt, and thus the Commodore's grandson, had commissioned an entirely different kind of mansion. This was the house that would come to be known simply as the Breakers, constructed between the years of 1893 and 1895, also in Newport. If Marble House was an attempt to recreate the Chateau of France, the Breakers was an attempt to build an Italian Renaissance palazzo directly on the cliffs of the Rhode Island coast. The Breakers was vast in a way that almost defied comprehension. 70 rooms, 250,000 square feet of floor space, a great hall that rose 50 feet from the floor to the ceiling with a painted fresco overhead and a marble floor laid out in intricate patterns. Elaborate bathrooms with machinery that brought both hot and cold water, a luxury that most Americans at that time had never encountered. Ornate bedrooms, a library containing 10,000 volumes, a kitchen that was itself a palace in miniature, designed to feed the large household of family members and guests that might assemble for a summer month. The Breakers cost $5 to $6 million to construct. It was designed by the architectural firm McKim, Mead and White. It was built not as a reconstruction of an Italian palazzo, but as something more ambitious, a genuine palace, in the sense that it had been built without regard to cost, designed by one of the greatest architectural firms in the world, staffed with craftsmen who were the equal of the artists who had worked on the actual Renaissance palaces of Italy. The gardens alone, stretching down the cliffs toward the ocean, covered 40 acres. To maintain the breakers, the staff required to keep it functioning took a force of nearly 100 people: gardeners, cooks, maids, valets, groundskeepers, stewards, and administrators. The cost of maintaining these houses, the property taxes, the staff, the upkeep, the replacement of worn materials, was itself a fortune. Marble House and the breakers together probably cost something like $1 million per year to maintain, in the money of the time. That is equivalent to perhaps $30 or $40 million per year in contemporary terms. The Vanderbilts, at the peak of their wealth and power, were spending something close to 2% of their total annual income simply to maintain the physical structures in which they spent perhaps 2 months each year. This was not thought to be excessive. This was not thought to be a problem. This was thought to be normal. This was thought to be what wealthy people did. And there was, in the logic of the Vanderbilt world, a strange kind of sense to it. These were not merely houses, they were statements. They were declarations to the world of the extent of the Vanderbilt fortune. They were also, quite explicitly, reflections of a particular ideology about the purpose of wealth. Wealth, in the eyes of the Vanderbilt family and the society that surrounded them, was not something to be preserved or reinvested or carefully managed for the future. Wealth was something to be spent, lavishly and beautifully, on the creation of structures and experiences that had no economic purpose whatsoever. The houses existed not because the Vanderbilts needed to live in them. They could have lived quite comfortably in residences that cost 1/10 as much, but because the building of these houses was an expression of power. Power expressed through marble, through gold leaf, through the labor of thousands of craftsmen and artists, all directed toward the single purpose of creating spaces in which the Vanderbilts might drink champagne and listen to music for a few weeks each summer. In this way, the marble houses were both the greatest achievement and the first indication of the death of the Vanderbilt fortune. They were magnificent. They were also, quite precisely, the beginning of the end. Newport, Rhode Island, in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, was unlike anywhere else in America. It was not a city in any ordinary sense. It was not a place where people conducted business or built industries or made things. It was a place where the wealthiest families in America came for a few months each summer to pretend, for a brief moment, that they were something other than what they had become: businessmen and their wives, people who had made their money through industrial enterprise and railroad finance and the accumulation of capital. Newport offered them a fiction. In Newport, they could imagine that they were aristocrats living in the manner of European nobility, with estates and servants and social hierarchies based not on the vulgarity of commerce, but on the refinement of taste, manners, and breeding. The houses that the Vanderbilts and their peers built in Newport were physical representations of this fantasy. They were not built to be lived in year-round. They were built as the stages for what was called the season, a social calendar that ran, roughly, from June through September, during which wealthy families moved to Newport, opened their houses, and engaged in an elaborate ritual of social interaction. The season was, in many ways, a continuation of the ball of 1883, expanded to encompass an entire summer. A wealthy family would arrive in Newport. They would open their mansion. The servants would remove the covers from the furniture. The gardens would be checked and perfected. And then, for the next 2 or 3 months, the family would entertain, constantly, exhaustingly, elaborately. There were balls and dinners, yes, but also breakfasts, luncheons, teas, and dinners again. There were sailing regattas and tennis tournaments and charity functions. There were visits to other houses and receptions in one's own house. There were card games and conversations, and the display of jewelry and the careful calibration of who was invited to what event and who was, pointedly, not invited. It was a world of almost unimaginable privilege and almost unimaginable boredom. For the men, there was at least the novelty of competition and the discussion of business. The Vanderbilts and their peers were still, despite their retreat to Newport for the summer, engaged in the operation of vast enterprises. The railroads ran all summer, the stocks traded all summer, the money continued to accumulate. For the women, who were generally not permitted to involve themselves in the details of business, the season existed primarily as an opportunity for the display of status through the medium of consumption. A woman in Newport society was expected to have an enormous wardrobe, purchased in Paris or New York or London, changed multiple times per day depending on the event. She was expected to wear jewelry, diamonds, pearls, rubies, that had cost fortunes in their own right. She was expected to know with absolute precision the social standing of every family in the summer colony, the history of their wealth, the marriages that had connected them or separated them, and the precise ranking of their importance in the rigid hierarchy of Newport society. This was the world into which Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in the year of our Lord 1876. She was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva, and she was, by virtue of her birth, one of the most prominent young women in America. She was beautiful in the way that girls with unlimited access to the finest clothing and jewelry and beauty treatments of the age could be beautiful. She was educated in the way that wealthy girls were educated: languages, music, history, art, but not anything so vulgar as to suggest that she might actually be expected to work for her living. She was, in other words, perfect material for the marriage market that existed in Newport and New York during the 1890s. And it was precisely because she was perfect material that her story would become, in many ways, the tragedy that defined the Gilded Age Vanderbilt experience. Because Consuelo Vanderbilt did not want to participate in the season, she did not want to become one of the mannequins in the elaborate display of wealth and status. And most importantly, she did not want to marry the man that her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, had selected for her. The season had one other function beyond the display of wealth and status. It was a marriage market. Young women were brought to Newport to be displayed, and the hope was that they would attract the attention of suitable young men, men who were wealthy, or who had titles, or, ideally, who had both. The Vanderbilts and their peers did not think of this as mercenary, though it certainly was. They thought of it as the natural order of things. A young woman of good family and good breeding should marry a man of equivalent standing. If that man happened to have a title, so much the better. If his title came with an estate, and that estate was in England, and he needed money to maintain that estate, well, that was simply the way the world worked. An English title was worth a certain amount of money. The Vanderbilt fortune was worth a certain amount of title. The exchange was made, and everybody was satisfied, except perhaps for the young woman in question. The gentlemen of the season conducted themselves with a kind of knowing pleasure in their own privilege. They smoked cigars on the verandas. They discussed the stock market and railroad consolidation. They admired each other's yachts and properties. The competition among them was fierce but conducted according to strict social rules. Nobody was permitted to simply announce his wealth. Instead, wealth was displayed through restraint, through the careful accumulation of objects and experiences that were understood within the community to be markers of the highest status. A man who was truly wealthy, in the understanding of Newport society, did not need to boast about his money. He simply allowed it to be observed through the quality of his surroundings. The marble floors, the oil paintings, the collections of first-edition books, the gardens designed by the most famous landscape architects, these things spoke for themselves. A man who arrived at a dinner party in a new automobile was thought to be displaying his wealth in rather a vulgar fashion. A man whose automobile was 3 years old but had been maintained to absolute perfection was thought to have achieved a higher understanding of what wealth truly meant. The ladies of the season occupied a kind of strange, liminal space between genuine power and complete powerlessness. They were expected to be ornamental, to serve as displays of their family's wealth and status through their clothing, jewelry, and appearance. But they were also expected to be intelligent, to understand the social hierarchies, and to navigate them skillfully, to know which families were rising and which were falling, and to conduct themselves in ways that maximized their own family's position. This was particularly true of the matriarchs, the older women who had weathered marriages and scandals and the passage of decades. These women often exercised genuine power in the social structure. They determined who was invited to which events. They enforced social rules. They could, if they chose, declare a person or a family to be socially unacceptable, which was effectively to exile them from Newport society. Alva Vanderbilt, despite her origins in commerce rather than inherited wealth, had become one of these powerful women. She understood the rules, and she understood how to bend them to her advantage. The Newport season was also, in its way, a kind of escape. It was an escape from the realities of American life that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Outside of Newport, in the cities and towns of America, industrial workers were laboring in dangerous conditions for meager wages. Child labor was rampant. Labor unions were forming and conducting strikes that were sometimes met with violence. The political climate was becoming increasingly turbulent. There were reformers and radical thinkers who were openly questioning whether it was just or sustainable for such vast fortunes to accumulate in the hands of a few families while the working population lived in poverty. But in Newport, in the great mansions and on the carefully manicured lawns and beaches, none of this seemed to penetrate. The season was a world unto itself, a carefully constructed fiction in which the wealthy could pretend that the social order that favored them was natural and permanent and right. The season was, in a very real sense, a kind of mass delusion, conducted with great elegance and perfect manners, a refusal to acknowledge that the world outside Newport was changing in ways that would eventually destroy the conditions that made Newport possible. Consuelo Vanderbilt was in love, or thought herself to be, with a young man named Winthrop Rutherford. He was American, which meant he had no title. He was reasonably wealthy, which was good, but not extraordinarily wealthy, which was less good. In the marriage market of the 1890s, Winthrop Rutherford represented a certain kind of appropriate match. A man from a good family, with sufficient money, with whom Consuelo might have been expected to live a life of comfortable privilege and mild happiness in New York and Long Island. But Alva Vanderbilt had other plans. She had, in fact, much grander plans for her daughter. She had conceived of the possibility that Consuelo might marry not an American businessman, but an English nobleman. She had conceived, more specifically, of the possibility that Consuelo might marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough, one of the great hereditary titles in England, a man who carried with him estates and history, and a name that went back to the time of Queen Anne and beyond. The Duke of Marlborough required money to maintain his position. The Vanderbilt family possessed more money than any family in America. It was a perfect match, in the sense that Alva understood such things. The only problem was that Consuelo did not want to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She wanted to marry Winthrop Rutherford. She was 19 years old, and she believed herself to be in love, and she could not understand why her mother, who had seemed in some ways to be a model of female independence and power, now insisted with such ferocity that she must marry a man she did not want to marry, a man from another country, a man who barely spoke to her, a man who saw in her nothing but a sum of money. Alva Vanderbilt was, in many ways, a formidable woman. She had used her husband's fortune to break into New York society. She had conducted affairs and created scandals. She had divorced her husband, which was nearly unthinkable in that era, and gone on to marry again. She was, by the standards of her time, a radical. But Alva Vanderbilt was also, without contradiction, a firm believer in the idea that marriage for women was a transaction, and that the transaction should be conducted according to the economic principles that governed the rest of life. If Consuelo could marry an English duke, then Consuelo should marry an English duke. The fact that Consuelo did not wish to do so was irrelevant. She was an asset of the family, and she should be deployed to the maximum advantage of the family's position. The courtship, if it could be called that, between Consuelo and the Duke of Marlborough was conducted with a kind of brutal efficiency. The Duke made clear that he required approximately $2 million to restore his estates and maintain his position. Alva Vanderbilt made clear that she could provide him with that sum, delivered in the form of railroad stock and government bonds, with the understanding that her daughter would become the Duchess of Marlborough and eventually the mother of a line of English aristocrats who would carry Vanderbilt blood. Consuelo resisted. She wept. She refused to cooperate. She insisted that she was in love with Winthrop Rutherford and that she would not marry the Duke. Alva Vanderbilt responded by becoming ill or by claiming to become ill. The distinction is not entirely clear, and by telling her daughter that the stress of Consuelo's rebellion was destroying her health, and that if Consuelo truly loved her mother, she would agree to marry the Duke. It was a kind of emotional blackmail, so complete in its mechanism that it almost achieved the status of art. Alva Vanderbilt had learned, it seemed, that the most powerful weapon a wealthy mother could wield against her daughter was not force, but the suggestion that the daughter's happiness was a luxury that must be sacrificed to the mother's health and the family's honor. On November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt was married to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, at St. Thomas's Church in New York. She was 18 years old. She wore a white gown that had cost thousands of dollars. She carried flowers that had been imported at considerable expense. She walked down the aisle toward a man she barely knew, with a smile painted on her face, while her mother watched from the pew with an expression that suggested satisfaction more than joy. The wedding was, by all accounts, a triumph of social mechanics. The guest list included most of the prominent people in New York society, though, interestingly, not most of the other Vanderbilt family members, who seemed to regard the proceedings with a kind of knowing skepticism. The newspapers reported it as the greatest wedding of the age. The ceremony united American money to English aristocracy. It was presented in the press as a romance, as a love story, as the triumph of a beautiful American girl over the skepticism of English society. None of these things were true. It was a transaction. Consuelo's mother had sold her daughter for $2 million worth of American railroad stock and the right to say that her daughter was a duchess. The marriage lasted 26 years before ending in a formal separation. During those years, Consuelo produced 2 sons who would inherit the dukedom and the title, and who would carry with them into the future a kind of watered-down version of the Vanderbilt genetic legacy. She lived mostly in England, in the great estates of the Marlborough family, performing the functions that were expected of a duchess, opening charity functions, hosting elaborate dinners, bearing and raising children. She was not happy. Later in her life, after the marriage had ended, she would write a memoir in which she described the wedding day with an almost clinical precision, emphasizing the coercion, the emotional manipulation, and the complete absence of her own agency in the decision that had shaped the rest of her life. But during the time when she was living the life of the Duchess of Marlborough, she did not indulge in such reflections. She did what was expected of her. She maintained the appearance of a satisfactory marriage, or at least a marriage that was not obviously a failure. And in this way, Consuelo Vanderbilt became quite literally the bridge between the American Vanderbilt fortune and the English aristocracy. Her sons inherited the dukedom, they inherited Vanderbilt money, and in this way, the greatest achievement of Alva Vanderbilt, the fusion of her family's commercial wealth with the social legitimacy of an ancient title, was secured not through marriage, but through the controlled sacrifice of her own daughter. The wealth that the Commodore had created, that William Henry had doubled, and that the Vanderbilt children were now in the process of elaborately displaying, did not actually increase significantly in the generation that followed. The railroads continued to generate enormous revenue, the stocks continued to pay dividends. The fortune remained, by any reasonable measure, vast, but it did not grow in the way that it had grown during the Commodore's lifetime or during William Henry's brief period of control. Instead, something else happened. The money began to be spent. This was not inevitable. It was not the result of poor business management or economic depression. It was the result of a fundamental philosophical shift. In the generation of the Commodore and William Henry, wealth had been a tool, an instrument by which to extend power and control. In the generation of their children and grandchildren, wealth had become an end in itself, something to be enjoyed, displayed, and consumed. The Vanderbilt children of the 1880s and 90s were almost universally taught nothing about business. They were not expected to work. They were not expected to manage the family enterprises. They were expected to inherit money and to live according to a standard of consumption that was appropriate to their station. The women married and had children. The men acquired titles or engaged in philanthropic activities or pursued whatever personal interests captured their attention, and all of them, without exception, spent money at a prodigious rate. A Vanderbilt daughter would have a wardrobe that contained hundreds of dresses, each of which might cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. She would have jewelry that filled vault-like safes, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, all of extraordinary quality and size. She would have a house, or perhaps multiple houses. She would have servants and a carriage, and all of the apparatus of wealth that was visible and tangible, and that demonstrated to anyone who cared to look that she possessed money. A Vanderbilt son would inherit his share of the family fortune and would embark on a life of leisure that might include yachting, the collection of art, the building of additional houses, the pursuit of beautiful women, or occasionally beautiful men, and the general expenditure of capital in ways that generated pleasure but not additional wealth. Some of the Vanderbilt men involved themselves in banking or law or public service. Many did not. They were supported entirely by the income from their inherited investments, and as long as the dividends continued to arrive, they continued to spend. The Vanderbilt grandchildren who came of age in the first decade of the 20th century inherited not just money, but the expectation that they would spend it. They had grown up in enormous houses. They had traveled to Europe. They had been educated in the finest schools. They had attended the finest events. And they had never, in the whole course of their lives, encountered any suggestion that the money would ever run out. This was not a rational belief. It was based on a kind of magical thinking, the belief that a fortune so enormous, so vast, that it exceeded the comprehension of normal minds, could somehow sustain any level of expenditure. The mathematics, as it happened, were more complicated than that. A fortune of $200 million, even if it generated a return of 5% per year, produced only $10 million in annual income. The Vanderbilt family, which by this time numbered in the dozens, all of whom expected to live in the manner that their wealth allowed, was spending something like $20 or $30 million per year. The mathematics were simple, though nobody seemed willing to acknowledge them. The family was spending more than it was earning. This did not produce an immediate catastrophe. Fortunes, especially enormous ones, have reserves that can absorb deficit spending for decades. But it produced a slow, steady erosion. The capital that the Commodore had built, that William Henry had doubled, began to diminish. Not dramatically, not noticeably, certainly not noticeably enough to change the behavior of the people who were spending it. But year by year, dollar by dollar, the fortune contracted. The grandchildren did not understand this. They could not understand it. They had grown up in an environment in which want was literally incomprehensible. If they wanted something, they had it. If they wanted to travel, they traveled. If they wanted to build a house, they built a house. The idea that there might be a limit to this, that the money might someday run out, seemed almost impossible to grasp. It was not that they were stupid. Many of the Vanderbilt grandchildren were quite intelligent, but they had lived their entire lives within the bubble of family wealth, and the bubble had become so normal, so expected, so much a part of the air they breathed, that they could not imagine what life might be like if the bubble burst. This was the critical difference between the Commodore's generation and the grandchildren's generation. The Commodore knew what poverty was. He had lived it. He had started with $100 and a small boat, and he understood, in his bones, that money was not automatic. William Henry had inherited nearly $100 million, but he had worked. He had managed the family enterprises. He had spent his energy and intelligence and will on the preservation and expansion of the family fortune. But the grandchildren had inherited far more than money. They had inherited the expectation that money would perpetually generate itself without effort, without attention, without anything but the passive receipt of dividends. In this way, The second and third generations of Vanderbilt wealth were different from the first. The Commodore had been a machine for the creation of wealth. William Henry had been a machine for the preservation and modest expansion of wealth. But the grandchildren were machines for the consumption of wealth. And consumption, unlike creation, is a process that eventually runs dry. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest of William Henry's sons, died in 1901, his estate was valued at approximately $70 million. Still an enormous sum, but substantially less than his father's fortune had been. The estate was divided among his widow and his children, and each portion was again subject to taxation. When these heirs, in turn, died or made major expenditures, the same process repeated. The capital that had been accumulated so carefully in the 19th century was fragmenting, dispersing, and being consumed by the tax system and by the spending of the heirs. This did not happen quickly. The Vanderbilt fortune was large enough that even modest returns on investment, combined with careful estate management, could have sustained the family in considerable wealth through many generations. But the Vanderbilt family did not choose to manage their fortune carefully. They chose to spend it. And spending, in a world where the capital base was shrinking and the tax burden was increasing, was the fastest possible route to impoverishment. It is important to understand that the income tax and the inheritance tax were not viewed favorably by the wealthy in the early part of the 20th century. They believed, quite sincerely, that taxation of this kind was a violation of their rights as property owners. They believed that money they had earned, or that had been passed down to them through their families, should remain their property to do with as they wished. The idea that the government should claim a portion of their inheritance, or that they should have to pay taxes on their income, seemed to them to be an overreach of government authority. But Roosevelt and his successors, and eventually the American electorate, came to believe that such concentrations of wealth were incompatible with democratic governance. And so the taxes were levied, and the Vanderbilt family, like the other great fortunes of the Gilded Age, found themselves paying a steadily increasing portion of their income and their estates to the government. The division of the estate between multiple heirs was another factor that contributed to the erosion of Vanderbilt wealth. In the Commodore's will, he had concentrated the bulk of his fortune in the hands of a single heir, his son, William Henry. William Henry, in turn, had attempted to do something similar, but had been persuaded by his wife and family members to divide his estate somewhat more broadly among his children and grandchildren. As the fortune was divided and subdivided into smaller and smaller parcels, the economies of scale that had made the original fortune possible began to disappear. A man with $200 million could, through careful management and shrewd investment, perpetually generate wealth. A woman with $10 million, depending on her own skills and inclination to do the work of preserving capital, might simply spend it. And a man with $5 million, after paying taxes on his inheritance and maintaining a household and paying for his children's education, might find that the capital base was shrinking year by year. By the 1920s, it had become clear to anyone paying attention that the Vanderbilt family, while still extraordinarily wealthy by any reasonable measure, was no longer in the process of accumulating capital. It was in the process of consuming it. The great houses that had been built with such pride and such expense were beginning to seem like monuments to a kind of hubris, reminders that even the mightiest fortunes when confronted with taxation, division, and the personal spending habits of the wealthy, could eventually be reduced. There was, in this period, a strange kind of denial. The Vanderbilts did not acknowledge the contraction of their fortune. They did not publicly admit that the money was running out. Instead, they continued to conduct themselves as if they had always conducted themselves, with a kind of assumed permanence of privilege. But the mathematics were working themselves out, regardless of what the Vanderbilts chose to believe. In the year 1926, a group of investors purchased the mansion at No. 1 West 57th Street in Manhattan. This was the house that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built in 1883. It was the largest single-family residence in New York City. It was an enormous chateau, built in the French Renaissance style, with countless rooms, elaborate decorations, and all of the apparatus of Gilded Age grandeur. The widow of Cornelius Vanderbilt, Alice Vanderbilt, had lived in the house after her husband's death, and had remained there as her daughters and sons had grown and moved away and begun to establish their own households. But eventually, even Alice Vanderbilt had to accept that the house was becoming impossible to maintain. The taxes had increased, the costs of staff had increased, the value of the building as a residence had declined because nobody wanted to live in such enormous, expensive structures anymore. There were younger, smaller, more practical houses now. The days of the great mansion were ending. Alice Vanderbilt sold the house for $7 million. The buyers immediately announced their intention to demolish it. In its place, they would build a commercial building, a grand department store, designed by one of the finest architectural firms in the city. The department store would be called Bergdorf Goodman, and it would be a success. But the Vanderbilt mansion, which had been thought, just decades earlier, to be the greatest private residence in the Western Hemisphere, was torn to the ground. 1 year later, in 1927, the mansion at number 660 Fifth Avenue was also demolished. This was the house that Alva Vanderbilt had used to host her famous costume ball in 1883. This was the French Renaissance palazzo that had cost $11 million to build, and $7 million of those dollars simply to acquire the marble. It had been completed with a sense of triumph, a declaration that the Vanderbilts had arrived at the absolute pinnacle of New York society. But 70 years was not as long as the Vanderbilts had assumed when they commissioned the house. In 1927, it was sold to a commercial developer, who demolished it and built an office building in its place. The site is now occupied by a modern office tower, and there is nothing remaining to indicate that one of the greatest houses in American history once stood there. These demolitions were, in a certain sense, the final triumph of the mathematics that had been working themselves out through the decades. The houses that had been built as permanent expressions of Vanderbilt power and Vanderbilt wealth were being removed from the landscape, not because the Vanderbilts had sold them out of choice, but because nobody could afford to maintain them anymore. They were too expensive, too large, too much a relic of an era that had passed. In their place, the city built commercial structures, office buildings, stores, the functional, practical architecture of a new age. But the destruction of the houses was not simply a matter of economics. It was also, in a strange way, a reflection of the psychological reality of the Vanderbilt family in the 1920s. The houses had been built as monuments to a permanent state of wealth and power. They had been built with the assumption that the money would never run out, that the fortune would continue to grow indefinitely, and that the grand estates would stand as testaments to Vanderbilt power for generations to come. But this assumption had proven false. The money was running out, the fortune was contracting, and the houses, which had seemed so permanent, so indestructible, so much a part of the landscape of New York and Newport, were being torn down. Marble House in Newport survived longer. It remained in the hands of Alva Vanderbilt and then her heirs through the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s. But eventually, it too was recognized as becoming a liability. It was too expensive to maintain. The structure itself was deteriorating. Nobody wanted to live in such an enormous house anymore. But the house, as it happened, had one advantage over its Manhattan cousins. It had been built not as a private speculation, but as what its owners called a cottage, and there was a sense in which it had always been somewhat apart from the ordinary real estate market. In 1955, Alva Vanderbilt's daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, donated Marble House to the Preservation Society of Newport County. It was perhaps the most fitting ending for the great Vanderbilt mansions. They passed from private hands to public stewardship, and the houses that had been built as expressions of private wealth were transformed into museums, places where ordinary people could come to look at the rooms where the Vanderbilts had spent their summers, and to marvel at the scale and expense and sheer excess of it all. These demolitions were, in a certain sense, the final triumph of the mathematics that had been working themselves out through the decades. The houses that had been built as permanent expressions of Vanderbilt power and Vanderbilt wealth were being removed from the landscape, not because the Vanderbilts had sold them out of choice, but because nobody could afford to maintain them anymore. They were too expensive, too large, too much a relic of an era that had passed. In their place, the city built commercial structures, office buildings, stores, the functional, practical architecture of a new age. But the destruction of the houses was not simply a matter of economics. It was also, in a strange way, a reflection of the psychological reality of the Vanderbilt family in the 1920s. The houses had been built as monuments to a permanent state of wealth and power. They had been built with the assumption that the money would never run out, that the fortune would continue to grow indefinitely, and that the grand estates would stand as testaments to Vanderbilt power for generations to come. But this assumption had proven false. The money was running out, the fortune was contracting, and the houses, which had seemed so permanent, so indestructible, so much a part of the landscape of New York and Newport, were being torn down. Marble House in Newport survived longer. It remained in the hands of Alva Vanderbilt and then her heirs through the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s. But eventually it too was recognized as becoming a liability. It was too expensive to maintain. The structure itself was deteriorating. Nobody wanted to live in such an enormous house anymore. But the house, as it happened, had one advantage over its Manhattan cousins. It had been built not as a private speculation, but as what its owners called a cottage. And there was a sense in which it had always been somewhat apart from the ordinary real estate market. In 1955, Alva Vanderbilt's daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, donated Marble House to the Preservation Society of Newport County. It was, perhaps, the most fitting ending for the great Vanderbilt mansions. They passed from private hands to public stewardship, and the houses that had been built as expressions of private wealth were transformed into museums, places where ordinary people could come to look at the rooms where the Vanderbilts had spent their summers, and to marvel at the scale and expense and sheer excess of it all. This transformation, from private mansion to public museum, was not unique to Marble House. The Breakers, the even more enormous palace that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built in the 1890s, was also eventually donated to the Preservation Society. In this way, the great houses of the Gilded Age were preserved not because they were still being used as residences, not because they still served the purposes for which they had been built, but because they had become historical artifacts. They had become, in a sense, more valuable as reminders of a vanished world than they could ever have been as living spaces. The houses, in coming down, told a story that the Vanderbilt family seemed reluctant to acknowledge. The story was this: that fortunes, no matter how vast, no matter how carefully accumulated, are not permanent. They are subject to taxation, to division, to the inevitable spending of those who inherit them. And if those who inherit do not take active steps to preserve and expand the fortune, if they do not apply the same ruthlessness and discipline that created the wealth in the first place, then the wealth will, gradually and inexorably, be consumed. Some of the Vanderbilts adapted. Some found ways to make money, or to at least preserve what remained of their inheritance through careful management and sensible living. Others did not. Some lived lives of remarkable excess, spending without restraint, and by the 1960s and 70s, they found themselves in a state that would have been incomprehensible to their great-grandfather. They had no money. The marble mansions were gone. The great estates had been sold or donated. The jewelry and art had been dispersed. The staff of servants had been laid off decades earlier. What remained was a name, a history, the memory of a time when the Vanderbilt family had been at the absolute center of American wealth and power. What remained were the photographs and the stories, passed down from generation to generation, of the way things had been. The Breakers still stands in Newport, now maintained by the Preservation Society, open to tourists who pay an admission fee to walk through the rooms where Cornelius Vanderbilt II once held court. Marble House still stands as well, also open to the public, also transformed into a kind of museum of the past. In the summer, tourists move through these houses, looking at the marble and the gilt and the elaborate furnishings, and they wonder at the excess, at the scale, at the amount of money that was spent on structures that were used for a few weeks each year. What they are looking at is not primarily a display of wealth. It is a display of something more subtle and more poignant. A display of the way that wealth, when divorced from the discipline that created it, transforms into something else. The great houses of Newport are not monuments to the triumph of capitalism. They are monuments to the fragility of fortunes, to the ease with which extraordinary wealth can be converted into extraordinary waste, and to the historical truth that nothing, not even the greatest private fortune ever accumulated in American history, is truly permanent. Some of the Vanderbilts adapted. Some found ways to make money, or to at least preserve what remained of their inheritance through careful management and sensible living. Others did not. Some lived lives of remarkable excess, spending without restraint, and by the 1960s and 70s they found themselves in a state that would have been incomprehensible to their great-grandfather. They had no money. The marble mansions were gone. The great estates had been sold or donated. The jewelry and art had been dispersed. The staff of servants had been laid off decades earlier. What remained was a name, a history, the memory of a time when the Vanderbilt family had been at the absolute center of American wealth and power. What remained were the photographs and the stories, passed down from generation to generation, of the way things had been. The Breakers still stands in Newport, now maintained by the Preservation Society, open to tourists who pay an admission fee to walk through the rooms where Cornelius Vanderbilt II once held court. Marble House still stands as well, also open to the public, also transformed into a kind of museum of the past. In the summer, tourists move through these houses, looking at the marble and the gilt and the elaborate furnishings, and they wonder at the excess, at the scale, at the amount of money that was spent on structures that were used for a few weeks each year. What they are looking at is not primarily a display of wealth. It is a display of something more subtle and more poignant, a display of the way that wealth, when divorced from the discipline that created it, transforms into something else. The great houses of Newport are not monuments to the triumph of capitalism. They are monuments to the fragility of fortunes, to the ease with which extraordinary wealth can be converted into extraordinary waste, and to the historical truth that nothing, not even the greatest private fortune ever accumulated in American history, is truly permanent. The Vanderbilt story contains within it a lesson that each generation must learn anew. Money, once made, is not preserved by itself. Wealth does not perpetuate itself automatically across generations. The Commodore understood this because he had experienced poverty. His son William Henry understood it because he had worked, had managed, had attended to the details of his fortune. But their children and grandchildren, born into circumstances of extreme privilege, could not understand it. They could not grasp that the mathematics of their inheritance were moving against them. They could not believe that the money would run out, and so the money did run out. The mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue was torn down. The mansion at 1 West 57th Street was torn down. The Commodore's great fortune, which had exceeded the national treasury, was dispersed and consumed and lost. And in 1973, 120 Vanderbilts gathered together to remember what they had been, and discovered that they were no longer what they had been. This is the end of the ledger. This is the final accounting of the Vanderbilt fortune. It is a story of magnificent achievement and magnificent waste, of the creation of wealth and the destruction of wealth, all conducted across the span of less than 100 years. The ledger is balanced, the fortune is gone, and what remains is what always remains when the money has been spent. A story that people will tell for generations to come. A story about the boy on the Staten Island ferry who became the Commodore, about his son who doubled his fortune, about his grandchildren who spent it, about his great-grandchildren who had nothing left. The houses are gone, the servants are gone, the jewelry has been scattered, the vast estates have been subdivided or demolished. But the story remains. The story of the Vanderbilts remains, a quiet reminder that even the mightiest fortunes are subject to the laws of mathematics and human nature, and that the preservation of wealth requires a discipline that is not easy to maintain across the passing of generations. The lamp is dimmed, the ledger is closed, and that is what remains. Sleep well.